Davis, a university town nestled amidst the rolling orchards of California's Central Valley. The food co-op, the weekly performers circle at the community center, the variety of froyo establishments. Davis, where so many people ride bicycles that the United States Bicycling Hall of Fame is found on 3rd Street. But Davis is no longer the quiet town it once was. Now Davis residents are being stalked by a menace that must be rooted out at all cost. If these 12 criminals aren't in prison soon, they could destroy Davis forever.
Each person has the same charges. There's 21 total counts for each person. So each person has 20 counts of 647C, which is obstructing, willfully and maliciously obstructing a public thoroughfare, and 1 count of conspiracy to commit a misdemeanor, and that being the obstruction of a thoroughfare. So essentially, as I like to phrase it, 20 counts of sitting and 1 count of conspiracy to sit.
I'm speaking with UC Davis professor Joshua Clover, one of the accused, in a Pete's Coffee in Oakland.
So those are the total charges. Each of them comes with a possibility of 6 months in jail, except for the conspiracy, which comes with a possible year in jail. And those can be stacked, as they say. So if one was committed of all 21, that would be 11 years in jail. And then there's a request for $1 million restitution total, I guess, divided among the 12 of us.
What public thoroughfare was so important that the 12 people accused of blocking it could face up to 11 years in jail apiece and $1 million total? In front of a bank. Where else? The so-called Davis Dozen, 11 students and Professor Clover, stand accused of blockading the U.S. Bank branch on campus. The bank closed up shop and sued the school for not removing the blockaders. The school countersued the bank for closing up shop and breach of contract. Students and faculty got slapped with criminal charges. The whole thing occurred during this past year's wave of protests throughout the UC system over tuition hikes. You may recall how, on November 9th, a group at UC Berkeley attempted to occupy a small space to the side of an administration building and were beaten and arrested by riot police wielding clubs, and how a week later, some Davis student activists professing solidarity with the Berkeley protesters occupied a small portion of the quad and were told to leave, and how when they refused, they caught what one might call hella pepper spray to the face. Aaron Beatty, the blogger and tweeter known as Zungu Zungu, is a graduate student at Berkeley and has dug through the assorted what officially went wrong reports produced in the wake of these incidents. The reports are supposedly a form of accountability, but as Beatty has pointed out, have almost entirely been ignored and produce no modification to procedure. Ironically, I'm talking to him here at UC Berkeley's Free Speech Movement Cafe.
What happened at Davis happened the week after what happened at Berkeley.
Right.
Because, and you know, the thing at Berkeley, they were told they couldn't use pepper spray, so they used the clubs.
Batons, yeah.
At Davis, they were told they couldn't use clubs because of what had happened at Berkeley, and then, you know, John Pike runs wild with pepper spray, right? Like, there's a relationship between the two that are, you know, and like, the thing that happened here was, you know, they were talking all about how, like, Occupy Oakland might come to the Berkeley campus, which is, I mean, that's, sure, that could happen, that did happen. It makes no sense to be worried about that in Davis, like Occupy Sacramento, all 20 of them are going to come, you know, like overrun the camp, like what is the threat? But because they're mapping what happened on at Berkeley onto what's happening at Davis, and like you see that in the reports, right? Like they're actually kind of saying, well, this happened at Berkeley, so therefore we'll respond this way at Davis.
Beatty was moved to remark upon how routine and predictable these crackdowns are.
I can say, having seen police run wild on Berkeley students 4 times since I've been here, every time it's a similar dynamic where, like, there's a sort of mild group of student protesters maybe doing something relatively mild. The police enter to solve it. using precise force, and everybody flips the fuck out because it's insane, and then it just escalates until the moment when the police leave.
The model comes from careful planning. A UC police chief, Santa Barbara's Dustin Olson, recently wrote the manual on this. His article, entitled Essential Ingredients to Working with Campus Protests and Demonstrations, was published in Campus Law Enforcement Journal, which would appear to be a thing that exists. In it, Olson builds on the earlier work of UC Berkeley's John Searle, whose 1971 The Campus War wrote of the free speech movement as a terrifying battle between an unprepared chancellor's office and an organized student opposition. Searle recalls feeling depressed beholding this friendly assemblage of self-effacing vice-chancellors, key-punch operators, and mild-mannered secretaries assembled to do battle against the largest, best-organized, and most competently led radical student army in the history of the country. It is no surprise where this way of thinking has taken so many campus police forces.
To me, the underlying problem is simply that you treat protest and civil disobedience as a criminal problem, and what that then signifies is it's like a fire you have to put out. There is no, and this goes back to the experience of the 60s and like what John Searle takes from all of that in his book that he writes while he's working in the chancellor's office. This sense that student protest is a senseless kind of upsurge of like primitive id that's just going to happen, and so the way you deal with it is never you never engage with the protesters or the occupiers as political subjects. Like, you never engage with them as people you could have a conversation with, people who might have a legitimate grievance. You treat them as a problem to be solved by a precise use of force, and so like that situation is gonna explode in a different way each time. Like, it'll be clubs, and then it'll be pepper spray, and next time it'll be something else, right? Or now it's lawsuits, right? Or now it's criminal charges.
Evan Buswell, one of the Davis dozen facing the criminal charges Beatty mentioned, agrees about the essential unwillingness of administrators to deal with student protesters evenly. According to Buswell, the tactics available to police in putting down backlash aren't the point. The point is that putting down the backlash is part and parcel of the university's restructuring, from public good to private investment. Here he is talking to me in a coffee shop in Davis.
You can't look at the protesters as having started something by protesting, that's not the beginning of the conflict. The beginning of the conflict are the austerity measures, which when they put those in place, they know there's going to be resistance, and they know that, they have to do their best to stamp down the resistance in order to be able to put these things in place. That's the entire thing of it. It's not a matter of, what is the best reaction they can have. They've already planned for the reaction before the protest is even occurring.
So if the crackdowns are just one small piece of public universities' long-term plan, let's take one step back to the long-term plan. Ideally, what distinguishes public universities from private universities is that public universities are funded by the public, and private universities are funded privately, with tuition paid by students. Increasingly, at the University of California, the funding is coming from tuition. Why are universities making this shift from publicly funded to privately funded? In other words, why are tuitions rising? The answer that conventional whiz dumbasses on television will offer is that budget cuts are eating away at the funds available for public education. If they're Democrats, they will say these cuts are bad. And if they're Republicans, they will say these cuts are good, but they'll both agree that it's about these cuts. As always, the answer is not so simple. Predictably, the budget crisis here is really an excuse for those in charge to get more of what they want. Because the UC Board of Regents doesn't actually want the public funding. Public education funding comes with pesky directions to put the money toward boring things like public education. But the regents aren't interested in funding public education. They're interested in funding high-budget construction projects. Public money can't go to that. Only private money can. Specifically, bonds. High-budget construction projects are financed mostly by bonds. Take, for instance, the Meyer and Renee Luskin Conference and Guest Center at UCLA. The UC Board of Regents voted unanimously this summer to fund it. It will house 25,000 square feet of meeting space, 250 guest rooms, and a new parking garage. Fancy! Luxurious! Meyer and Renee Luskin get to have their name on this conference and guest center because they gave $40 million to build the thing. But it's going to cost a lot more than $40 million to build. Like $112 million more dollars. And those dollars are all coming from bonds. Now, the bond market is a very confusing place that I know barely anything about. But I do know that if you're in an extreme financial emergency, which the Regents declared the UC system officially in, and you're having to lay off teachers and eliminate classes and raise tuitions, it should be hard for you to sell your bonds. They should be worth shit. You're not a solid investment. You're in an extreme financial emergency. And yet, Fitch keeps rating UC bonds at things like AA+, which, as bond ratings go, doesn't seem to warn of extreme financial emergency. In order to get such good bond ratings in the midst of an extreme financial emergency, UC has to promise some pretty solid collateral. It has to have some assets on reserve that, should the extreme financial emergency cause them to default on the bond, they can offer the big banks. What do they pledge? Future tuition hikes. These tuition hikes, in other words, aren't the product of a budget crisis. They are promises to Wall Street being kept. They pledged your tuition to Wall Street, Bob Meester titled his open letter to UC students. Meester is the president of the Council of UC Faculty Associations and a professor of political and social thought at UC Santa Cruz. Your tuition, he wrote, is UC's #1 source of revenue to pay back bonds, ahead of new earnings from bond-funded projects, which do not even come in second. The bond interest UC now pays will be $300 million this year and is projected to go way up as the UC greatly increases the private capital it raises through tuition-backed bonds over the next decade. So future students are paying for today's students' buildings, and the banks are standing above the whole affair with their money vacuums on full blast. This is very close to the objection Joshua Clover, the Davis professor, had to the erstwhile partnership between UC Davis and US Bank.
The $100,000 or whatever it is that the university gets from the bank every year, where do they think that money comes from? The bank doesn't literally make money. They don't have a printing press. They get that money from only one source, which is the students. They get it from money they successfully get from students for, let's say, fees, interest rates, penalty charges, and so on. If the money's going to come from students to fund the university, why have the bank sitting in the middle and taking a share of it? Why not just say, students, give us all each $20 more a year, and we'll spend it for the good of the university. And of course, students would complain about that, as they should. The fees are already too high. But the students aren't being saved any money by the bank's intervention. It's simply costing them more money. The money the bank gives to the university, they get from the students. They sit in the middle of the transaction, and they take a cut because they're a profit-making institution. So the defense that the university is getting money seemingly out of nowhere from banks to university is an absolute ludicrous fallacy.
Of course, they don't really mean future tuition, because tuition increasingly isn't coming straight from students to schools. It's coming from the banks, which is where tuition actually goes in the form of paying back student debt. If this all seems like a self-reinforcing system capable of producing a credit bubble, that's because it is, and the bubble is in student debt. Evan Buswell of the Davis Dozen is a PhD candidate in cultural studies and focusing on debt. He gives us a lay of the land.
The student loan market functions mostly simply to produce debt. And often, with increasing numbers of people going to school because they're unable to find any sort of job outside of school, it's essentially a process of accepting debt because there's no other way to stay alive.
My friend Sarah Jaffe, an editor at Alternet who's written a lot about student debt, told me over the phone how everyone's doing with the whole debt we were forced to take on situation.
You have people graduating from college, waiting tables, and they're supposed to be paying $400 a month on their student loan, and they just can't do it. So there's hundreds of thousands of people right now in default on their student loans because they just can't pay it with the jobs that actually exist right now.
Hundreds of thousands of people unable to pay back their debts to the bank. That's what just happened with mortgages in the last financial crash.
Our position as debtors is just as proxies in an attempt to create toxic assets and sell them to other people. I mean, we are essentially toxic assets as students. That's what we are.
Wait, issuing toxic debt and then selling it to other people? That happened with mortgages too.
Slabs are student loan asset-backed securities, and they are basically being traded the same way mortgage-backed securities are, right? In that you package a bunch of student loans and you sell them.
Hold on. There's a secondary market of investors who have bought up packages of toxic assets and bid up the price of education? If they've taken out credit default swaps on their slabs, it's all in place for another crash and another bailout. Or is it? Jaffe says the bailout is built into the deal.
The government basically guarantees loans that private lenders make, and the government can pursue you for life. You cannot discharge them in bankruptcy. They can garnish your Social Security.
And it's not a random collection agency the government sends after you.
Some of these collection agencies are owned by the very same big banks. So JP Morgan could essentially sell you your student loan, and then you default on your student loan. They get paid back by the government, and then they get paid, their collection agency that they own is getting paid by the government to collect the debt from you.
You're fucked by a bank everywhere you look. Want to go to a state college? Your tuition is rising in order for the regents to service their construction bonds by paying money to banks. In order to pay the tuition, you have to take on debts that will keep you paying money to banks for the rest of your life. Default on your student loans, the government pays money to the banks both to service the debt and to bully and harass you for the money. This is a massive profit-making machine. And if you dare even to sit in front of one bank, you stand to be thrown in jail for over a decade.
I think the university's position is that if they didn't bring excessive charges against us, then they could be legally seen as in breach of contract
with U.S. Bank.
With U.S. Bank, and I mean, like, I think that just points out to what a ridiculous situation it is to have a bank as your partner on campus, that you have to basically, like, you know, acquiesce to the whims of the bank against your own students.
With all the pressure to get the highest possible return on their investment in college, the student protesters have shrunken away from the struggle, according to Aaron Beatty, at least until the next spike in anger and compassion inevitably flares up.
They've raised the shit out of tuition since I've been here. They raised it 83% that one semester. If the tax thing doesn't pass, they'll raise it another 20%, and that'll be big numbers because we're already pretty high. But like every time that happens, it's like it just happens and you just suck it up and take it. And then the next time it happens, it's a little harder to be upset about it.
I have a hard time seeing how this all shakes out without some totally radical change. Neither apparently do Sarah Jaffe or Joshua Clover.
Without sort of changing the whole system, I don't know where it goes.
I think that banks in general are very, very bad for public education and private education in the form that they currently exist. And I think that the existence of education as a social good and the existence of banks need to be absolutely disentangled. And in fact, I basically think there shouldn't be banks.
Aaron Beatty sees the student movement, such as it has been so far, as a midpoint on the way to a much more fulsome political commitment.
Students and activists and kind of for public education people in general are struggling to work out the critique simultaneous with a very inarticulate no.
I submit the following critique for consideration. In capitalism, there are three relationships that people have to wealth. The first, the proletariat, is made up of workers whose labor generates value. The mechanic, the farmer, the flight attendant, the sales associate. This group is by far most people. The second group, the bourgeoisie, is made up of owners who capture that value in the form of profits. The CEO, the member of the corporate board of directors, the private equity baron. This is a tiny group of people. The last group, the petit bourgeoisie, is made up of managers who facilitate the whole process. The professional class, the doctor, the judge, the professor, basically the people whose traditional work uniform is a robe. After the Great Depression, the United States invented a new class called the middle class. Where did they find all of the people to make up the middle class? In the working class. There was no such thing as a brand new middle class, it was just the working class. But this working class was elevated above working class conditions by the New Deal, the GI Bill, the Marshall Plan in Europe, and so forth. This so-called middle class labored in the hope that they could forever ride upward on the perpetually rising wave of production and consumption we are encouraged to call the American dream. College was an essential part of this American dream and became a staple of the life this middle class felt entitled to as part of the whole being a middle class and not a working class deal. But in traditional pre-Great Depression capitalism, college was not a right of the working class. It was a luxury for the cultivation of the ownership class and their managers, a tradition which had previously been the case under feudalism as well. So the middle class being allowed to go to college en masse was a big step up from those families' previous working class life. The thing about that perpetually rising wave of production and consumption that we are encouraged to call the American dream is that it turns out to act just like all other waves, by crashing. In the digital age in which American workers have increased their productivity hugely with no increase to their real wages, the so-called middle class has only been able to keep up the incredible consumption schedule it is used to by taking on a shit ton of debt. We go into debt to buy the home that working class people aren't traditionally entitled to. We go into debt to buy the healthcare that working class people aren't traditionally entitled to. And we go into debt to buy the education that working class people aren't traditionally entitled to. So today, the middle class is simply the working class plus debt. The privatization of public universities is merely a return to the natural, harmonious capitalist order in which college is a privilege of wealth, and all of the rest of us just go out and work ourselves to death for the benefit of the ownership class. I put it to you that the way to meet the need of the working class isn't artificial elevation to middle class status on a mountain of debt, but cutting out the ownership class who has made debt peons of us all. We are not a middle class. We are workers. There is nothing shameful about being a worker. There is only shame in consenting to rich people's theft of our work. We can educate each other, thanks very much, without all their alleged help. J.A. Myerson, Citizen Radio.